history students. In this module, Module 7, we're going to be looking at the life and the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach lived from 1685 to 1750, and he was a German composer and a musician of the Baroque era. He enriched and established German styles through his skill in counterpoint, harmonic and motivic organization, and the adaptation of rhythms, forms, and textures from abroad, in particular from Italy and France. Bach's compositions include the Brandenburg Concertos, the Goldberg Variations, the Mass in B minor, and a great deal of music for the harpsichord and organ. He also wrote 2 Passions and over 300 cantatas, of which around 200 survive today. His music is revered for its technical command, artistic beauty, and intellectual depth. Bach was the 8th and youngest child born into a great musical family. His father, Johann Ambrose Bach, was the director of the town musicians, and all of his uncles were professional musicians. His father probably taught him to play the violin and harpsichord, and his brother, Johann Christoph Bach, taught him the clavichord and exposed him to much contemporary music. His uncles were all professional musicians whose posts included church organists, court chamber musicians, and composers. One of his uncles, Johann Christoph Bach, introduced him to the organ, and an older second cousin, Johann Ludwig Bach, was a well-known composer and violinist. Bach's mother died in 1694, and his father died 8 months later. Bach, at age 10, moved in with his older brother, Johann Christoph Bach. He was the organist at St. Michael's Church in Attenberg. When Johann Sebastian was with his brother, he continued to study, perform, and he even copied music, including his own brother's music, even though he was forbidden to do so because scores were so valuable and private and bank ledger paper of that type was very expensive. He received valuable teaching from his brother, who instructed him on the clavichord. J.C. Bach exposed him to the works of great composers of the day, including South German composers such as Pachelbel. As a matter of fact, Johann Christoph had studied under Pachelbel, and he also introduced Johann Sebastian to Froberger, who was a North German composer, and Frenchmen such as Jean-Baptiste Lully, Machard, Marais, and the Italian clavierist Frescobaldi. During this time, he was taught theology, Latin, Greek, French, and Italian at the local gymnasium or the local school. At age 14, Bach, along with his older school friend George Erdmann, was awarded a choral scholarship to study at the prestigious St. Michael's School in the Principality of Lüneburg. Although it is not known for certain, the trip was likely taken mostly on foot. His 2 years there were critical in exposing him to a wider facet of European culture. In addition to singing in the choir, he played the school's 3 manual organ and their harpsichords. He came into contact with sons of aristocrats from northern Germany, sent to the highly selective school to prepare for careers in other disciplines. In January 1703, shortly after graduating from St. Michael's, Bach was appointed court musician in the chapel of Duke Johann Ernst III in Weimar. His role there is unclear, but likely included menial, non-musical duties. During his 7-month tenure, his reputation as a keyboardist spread so much that he was invited to inspect the new organ and give the inaugural recital at St. Boniface's Church in Arnst, located about 30 kilometers or 19 miles from Weimar. In August 1703, he became the organist at St. Boniface's with light duties, a relatively generous salary, and a fine new organ tuned in the modern tempered system that allowed a wide range of keys to be used. Prior to this, the normal way of tuning was called a mean tone temperament. In this mean tone temperament, the major thirds are perfectly in tune with themselves, and the fourths and fifths are slightly compromised. This tuning system was fine for keys of up to about 4 sharps or 4 flats. With any more adjustments to the keys, as soon as you went to 5 sharps or flats, the very dissonant intervals could be heard. This modern or well-tempered tuning system, for the first time, allows the composer's freedom to include harmonic modulation in one direction or another, and to choose a key that mirrors the composer's thoughts. With well-tempered tuning, the tuning inaccuracies are spread equally over all 12 notes within the octave. Despite strong family connections and a musically enthusiastic employer, tension built up between Bach and the authorities after several years in the post. Bach was dissatisfied with the standard of singers in the choir, while his employer was upset by Bach's unauthorized absence from Arnst. Bach was gone for several months in 1705-1706 to visit the great composer and organist Buxtehude in St. Mary's Church. This visit involved a 450-kilometer or 280-mile journey each way, reportedly on foot. In 1706, Bach was offered a post as organist at St. Blasius' Church in Mulhausen, which he took up the following year. It included significantly higher remuneration, improved conditions, and a better choir. 4 months after arriving at Mulhausen, Bach married Maria Barbara Bach, his second cousin. They had 7 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. His sons, William Frederick Mann Bach and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, also became composers. Bach was able to convince the church and town government at Mulhausen to fund an expensive renovation of the organ at his church. Bach, in turn, wrote an elaborate festive cantata, Gott ist mein König, for the inauguration of the new council in 1708. The council paid handsomely for its publication, and it was a major success. In 1708, Bach left Mulhausen, returning to Weimar, this time as organist, and from 1714 on as the Concertmeister, or the director of music, at the ducal court, where he had an opportunity to work with a large, well-funded contingent of professional musicians. Bach and his wife moved into a house close to the ducal palace. In the following year, their first child was born, and Maria Barbara's elder unmarried sister joined them. She remained to help run the household until her death in 1729. Bach's time in Weimar was the start of a sustained period of composing keyboard and orchestral works. He attained the proficiency and confidence to extend the prevailing structures and to include influences from abroad. He learned to write dramatic openings and employ the dynamic rhythms and harmonic schemes found in the music of Italians, such as Vivaldi, Corelli, and Torelli. Bach absorbed these stylistic aspects in part by transcribing Vivaldi's string and wind concertos for harpsichord and organ. Many of these transcribed works are still regularly performed. Bach was particularly attracted to the Italian style in which one or more solo instruments alternate section by section with the full orchestra throughout a movement. In Weimar, Bach continued to play and compose for the organ and to perform concert music with the Duke's ensemble. He also began to write the preludes and fugues, which were later assembled into his monumental work, the Well-Tempered Clavier. Clavier really means clavichord or harpsichord. And there were 2 books. They were compiled in 1722 and 1744, each containing 24 preludes and fugues in every major and minor key, which demonstrated how effective the new well-tempered tuning method worked. Also in Weimar, Bach started work on the Little Organ Book, which contained traditional Lutheran chorales or hymn tunes set in complex textures. In the spring of 1714, Bach was promoted to Concertmeister, an honor that entailed performing a church cantata monthly in the castle church. In 1717, Bach eventually fell out of favor in Weimar and was, according to a translation of the court secretary's report, jailed for almost a month before being unfavorably dismissed. Leopold, the Prince of Cothen, hired Bach to serve as his Kapellmeister, or director of music, in 1717. Prince Leopold, himself a musician, appreciated Bach's talents, and he paid him well, and he gave him considerable latitude in composing and performing. The prince was a Calvinist and did not use elaborate music in his worship. Accordingly, most of Bach's work from this period was secular, including the orchestral suites, the cello suites, the sonatas and partitas for solo violin, and the Brandenburg concertos. Bach also composed secular cantatas for the court. A significant influence upon Bach's musical development during his years with the prince is recorded by Stauffer as Bach's complete embrace of dance music, perhaps the most important influence on his mature style, other than his adoption of Vivaldi's music in Weimar. Despite being born in the same year and only about 130 kilometers or 81 miles apart, Bach and Handel never met. In 1730, Bach's oldest son, Wilhelm Friedmann, traveled to invite Handel to visit the Bach family in Leipzig, but the visit never did happen. In 1720, when Bach was traveling with Prince Leopold, Bach's wife suddenly died. The following year, he met Anna Magdalena Wieck, a young, highly gifted soprano, 16 years younger than Bach. She performed at the court in Cothen. They married in 1721, and together they had 13 more children, 6 of whom survived into adulthood. In 1723, Bach was appointed Thomas Cantor, or cantor of the Thomas School, or the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, which served 4 churches in the city. He was musical director of public functions, such as city council elections. It was a prestigious post, which he held for 27 years until his death. It brought him into contact with the politics of his employer, Leipzig's city council. Bach was required to instruct the students of the Thomas School in singing and to provide church music for the main churches in Leipzig. Bach was required to teach Latin, but he was allowed to employ a deputy to do this instead. A cantata was required for the church services on Sundays and additional church holidays during the liturgical year. He usually performed his own cantatas, most of which were composed during his 3 years at Leipzig. Bach drew the soprano and alto choristers from the school and the tenors and basses from the school and elsewhere in Leipzig. Performing at weddings and funerals provided extra income for these groups. It was probably for this purpose and for in-school training that he wrote at least 6 motets. As part of his regular church work, he performed other composers' motets, which served as formal models for his own. Bach broadened his composing and performing beyond the liturgy by taking over, in March 1729, the directorship of the Collegium Musicum, a secular performance ensemble started by the composer George Philipp Telemann. This was one of the dozens of private societies in the major German-speaking cities that was established by musically active university students. These societies had become increasingly important in public musical life and were typically led by the most prominent professionals in a city. Year-round, the Leipzig Collegium Musicum performed regularly. Many of Bach's works during the 1730s and 1740s were written for and performed by these groups of musicians. Among these were the Klavierübung, or keyboard practice, and many of his violin and keyboard concertos. In 1747, Bach visited the court of King Frederick II at Potsdam. The king played a theme for Bach and challenged him to improvise a fugue based on his theme. Bach improvised a 3-part fugue on one of Frederick's forte pianos, which was then a novelty, and later presented the king with a musical offering, which consists of fugues, canons, and a trio based on this theme. Its six-part fugue includes a slightly altered subject more suitable for extensive elaboration. Bach's last large work was the Mass in B minor, which describes Bach's most universal church work, consisting mainly of recycled movements from cantatas written over a 35-year period. It allowed Bach to survey his vocal pieces one last time and pick select movements for further revision and refinement. Although the complete Mass was never performed during the composer's lifetime, it is considered to be among the greatest choral works of all time. On July 28, 1750, Bach died at the age of 65. A contemporary newspaper reported, quote, "the unhappy consequences of the very unsuccessful eye operation," end of quote, as the cause of his death. It's probable that the true cause is that Bach died of a stroke. Bach's estate included 5 harpsichords, 2 lute harpsichords, 3 violins, 3 violas, 2 cellos, a viola da gamba, a lute, and a spinet, and 52 sacred books, including books by Martin Luther, Jophus. He was originally buried at Old St. John's Cemetery in Leipzig. His grave went unmarked for nearly 150 years. In 1894, his remains were located and moved to a vault in St. John's Church. This building was destroyed by Allied bombing during World War II. So in 1950, Bach's remains were taken to their present grave in St. Thomas Church. Later research has called into question whether the remains in the grave are actually those of Bach. After his death, Bach's reputation as a composer at first declined. His works were regarded as old-fashioned compared to the emerging galant style. Initially, he was remembered more as a virtuoso player of the organ than as a teacher. Many of Bach's unpublished manuscripts were distributed among his wife and musician sons at the time of his death. Unfortunately, the poor financial condition of some of the family members led to the sale and subsequent loss of parts of Bach's compositions, including over 100 cantatas and his St. Mark Passion, of which no copies are known to survive. During the late 18th and early 19th century, Bach was recognized by several prominent composers for his keyboard work. Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann, and even Mendelssohn were among his admirers. They began writing in a more contrapuntal style after being exposed to Bach's music. Beethoven described him as the original father of harmony. Bach was best known during his lifetime as an organist, organ consultant, and composer of organ works in both the traditional German free genres, such as preludes, fantasies, and toccatas, and stricter forms, such as choral preludes and fugues. At a young age, he established a reputation for his great creativity and ability to integrate foreign styles into his organ works. Bach copied the works of numerous French and Italian composers to gain insights into their compositional languages, and later arranged violin concertos by Vivaldi and others for organ and harpsichord. During his most productive period, from 1708 to 1714, he composed about a dozen pairs of preludes and fugues, 5 toccatas and fugues, and a little organ book. After leaving Weimar, Bach wrote less for the organ. Bach was extensively engaged later in his life in consulting on organ projects, testing newly built organs, and dedicating organs in afternoon recitals. Bach wrote many works for harpsichord, some of which may have been played on the clavichord. The Well-Tempered Clavier, Books 1 and 2, consists of a prelude and fugue in each of the 24 major and minor keys, in chromatic order from C to B minor. Thus, the whole collection is often referred to as the 48. Well-tempered in the title refers to the temperament or the system of tuning. Many temperaments before Bach's time were not flexible enough to allow compositions to utilize more than just a few keys. The inventions and sinfonias are 2- and 3-part contrapuntal works arranged in the same chromatic order as the Well-Tempered Clavier, omitting some of the rarer keys. These pieces were intended by Bach for instructional purposes. There are 3 collections of dance suites: the English suites, the French suites, and the partitas for keyboard. Each collection contains 6 suites built on the standard model, which is allemande, courante, sarabande, and optionally a jig. The English suites closely follow the traditional model, adding a prelude before the allemande and including a single movement between the sarabande and the jig. The French suite omits the preludes but have multiple movements between the sarabande and the jig. The partitas expand the model further with elaborate introductory movements and miscellaneous movements between the basic elements of the model. The Goldberg variations is an area with 30 variations. The collection has a complex and unconventional structure. The variations build on the bass line of the area rather than its melody, and musical canons are used according to the grand plan. There are 9 canons with 30 variations. Every third variation is a canon. These variations move in order from canon at the unison to canon at the 9th. Miscellaneous pieces also are included under his keyboard compositions. For example, the French Overture in the French style, and the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue. The Anna Magdalena notebooks refer to either of the 2 manuscript notebooks that Bach presented to his second wife, Anna Magdalena. This keyboard music, which has minuets, rondos, polonaises, chorales, sonatas, preludes, musettes, marches, and gavottes, make up most of these notebooks, and a few pieces are included for voice. It provides a nearly unparalleled glimpse into the domestic music of the 18th century and the musical tastes of the Bach family. Among Bach's lesser-known keyboard works are 7 toccatas, 4 duets, sonatas for keyboard, the 6 little preludes, and the Aria Variety alla Maniera Italiana. We're going to be listening to the Prelude and Fugue number 21 in B-flat major. Before listening to this, let's go over how the fugue is structured. All of the Well-Tempered Claviers begin with a prelude, followed by a fugue. The prelude is a short keyboard work in improvisatory style and is often paired with a fugue. The structure of the fugue is amazing and interesting to study. A fugue is a contrapuntal compositional technique in 2 or more voices built on a subject or a theme that's introduced at the beginning. Most fugues open with a short main theme, the subject, which then sounds successively in each voice. After the first voice is finished stating the subject, a second voice repeats the subject at a different pitch, and other voices repeat in the same way. When each voice has entered, the exposition is complete. After the statement of the subject, a second voice enters and states the subject, with the subject transposed to another, often closely related key, and that's known as the answer. To make the music run smoothly, it may also have to be altered slightly. When the answer is an exact copy of the subject to the dominant, it's classified as a real answer. If it has to be altered in any way, it's a tonal answer. A tonal answer is usually called for when the subject begins with a prominent dominant note, or where there's a prominent dominant note very close to the beginning of the subject. To prevent an undermining of the music's sense of key, this note is transposed up a fourth to the tonic, rather than up a fifth to the supertonic. Answers in the subdominant are always employed for the same reason. While the answer is being stated, the voice in which the subject was previously heard continues with new material. If this new material is reused in later statements of the subject, it's called a counter-subject. If this accompanying material is only heard once, it's simply referred to as free counterpoint. Further entries of the subject follow this initial exposition, either immediately or separated by episodes. Episodic material is often sequential and is usually based on some element heard in the exposition. Each episode has primarily the function of transitioning for the next entry of the subject in a new key, and may also provide release from the strictness of form employed in the exposition and middle entries. You will frequently find examples of stretto, where one voice responds with the subject or answer before the first voice has completed its entry of the subject or answer. Usually, this increases the intensity of the music. Stretto is the Italian word which means to tighten. Now let's listen to the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, the Prelude and Fugue, number 21 in B-flat major. Bach wrote for single instruments, duets, and small ensembles. Many of his solo works, such as the 6 sonatas and partitas for violin, the 6 cello suites, and partita for solo flute, are widely considered among the most profound works in the repertoire. He wrote trio sonatas, solo sonatas, which were accompanied by continuo, for the flute and for the viola da gamba, and a large number of canons, mostly with unspecified instrumentation. The most significant examples of the latter are contained in The Art of Fugue and The Musical Offering. Bach's best-known orchestral works are the Brandenburg Concertos, so named because he submitted them in the hope of gaining employment from Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg in 1721. His application was unsuccessful. These works are examples of the concerto grosso genre. The concerto grosso Italian for big concert, is a form of Baroque music in which the musical material is passed between a small group of soloists, the concertino, and the full orchestra, the ripieno or the concerto grosso. This is in contrast to the solo concerto, which features a single solo instrument with the melody line accompanied by the orchestra. Other surviving works of the concerto form include two violin concertos. The concerto for two violins in D minor is often referred to as Bach's double concerto. And there's also concertos for 1 to 4 harpsichords. It's widely accepted that many of the harpsichord concertos were not original works, but arrangements of his concertos for other instruments now lost. A number of violin, oboe, and flute concertos have been reconstructed from these. In addition to concertos, Bach wrote 4 orchestral suites and a series of stylized dances for orchestra, each preceded by a French overture. Beginning mid-1723, Bach performed a cantata each Sunday and feast that corresponded to the church readings of the week. Although Bach performed cantatas by other composers, he composed at least 3 entire annual cycles of cantatas at Leipzig, in addition to those composed at Mühlhausen and Weimar. In total, he wrote more than 300 sacred cantatas, of which nearly 200 survive. His cantatas vary greatly in form and instrumentation, including those for solo singers, single choruses, small instrumental groups, and grand orchestras. Many consist of a large opening chorus followed by 1 or more recitative aria pairs for soloists or duets, and a concluding chorale. The recitative is part of the corresponding Bible reading for the week, and the aria is a contemporary reflection of it. The melody of the concluding chorale often appears as a cantus firmus in the opening movement. In addition, Bach wrote a number of secular cantatas, usually for civic events, such as council inaugurations. These include wedding cantatas, the peasant cantata, and the coffee cantata. Bach's motets are pieces on sacred themes for choir and basso continuo. Several of them were composed for funerals. Bach's large choral orchestral works include the grand-scale St. Matthew Passion and St. John Passion. These were both written for Good Friday Vesper in alternate years. The Christmas Oratorio is a set of 6 cantatas for use in the liturgical season of Christmas. Shorter works are the Easter Oratorio, the Ascension Oratorio, and the Magnificat. Bach assembled his last large work, the Mass in B minor, near the end of his life between 1748 and 1749. The Mass was never performed in full during Bach's lifetime. He derived many movements from his cantatas and composed some new movements. All of these movements have substantial solo parts as well as choruses. Bach's musical style arose from his skill in contrapuntal invention and motivic control, his flair for improvisation, his exposure to North and South German, Italian, and French music, and his devotion to the Lutheran liturgy. His access to musicians, scores, and instruments as a child and a young man, and his emerging talent for writing tightly woven music of powerful sonority allowed him to develop an eclectic, energetic musical style in which foreign influences were combined with intensified version of the pre-existing German musical language. From 1713 to 1714 onward, he learned much from the style of the Italians. During the Baroque period, many composers only wrote the framework, and performers embellished this framework with ornaments and other elaboration. This practice varied considerably between the schools of European music. Bach notated most or all of the details of his melodic lines, leaving little for performers to interpret. This accounted for his control over the dense contrapuntal textures that he favored, and decreased the leeway for spontaneous variation of musical lines. At the same time, Bach left the instrumentation of major works, including the art of the fugue, open. Bach's devout relationship with the Christian God and the Lutheran tradition, and the high demand for religious music of his times, placed sacred music at the center of his repertoire. His large-scale structure of sacred works is evidence of subtle, elaborate planning. For example, the St. Matthew Passion illustrates the Passion with Bible text reflected in recitatives, arias, choruses, and chorales. Bach's drive to display musical achievements was evident in his compositions. He wrote much for the keyboard and led its elevation from continuo to solo instrument with harpsichord concertos and keyboard obligato. Bach produced collections of movements that explored the range of artistic and technical abilities inherent in various genres. The most famous example is the Well-Tempered Clavier, in which each book represents a prelude and fugue in every major and minor key. Each fugue displays a variety of contrapuntal and fugal techniques. You've probably heard the toccata in D minor before. Bach's toccata and fugue in D minor came to be associated with Halloween. It's impossible to listen to the dramatic opening statement of this toccata without your mind turning to vintage black and white horror flicks or things that go bump in the night. But those notes haven't always been interpreted as spooky. Robert Schumann describes them as a reflection of Bach's sense of humor. Meanwhile, Felix Mendelssohn predicts the piece's eventual popularity when he called it learned and for the people in one of his letters. So how did it come to be a soundtrack for all things scary? The culprit here is Hollywood. Key placement in some early horror flicks is responsible for the piece's connection to the dark side. One of its first on-screen appearances was setting the atmosphere in the opening credits of the 1931 adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, followed by an unlucky appearance in The Black Cat a few years later. But it was a scene in the 1962 horror version of The Phantom of the Opera that cemented its spookiness, when the Phantom himself plays it on his dusty underground organ. Ever since then, it's been the go-to music to make a scene spooky in countless films, including Fantasia, Sunset Boulevard, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and more. Let's listen to the toccata and fugue in D minor. Today we're going to end with the cantata number 40, the first movement. This is probably one of his most famous cantatas. I hope you really enjoy listening to this. In the meantime, let's just go over your homework. If you could identify the fugal answers on page 29, fill in the blanks on pages 31, 32, and 34, and of course send your assignments to me. Remember, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm here to help you every step of the way. I hope you have a super duper week. Bye.